Should work. There we go.
There was something weird with new Zoom window popping up.
Okay.
Good luck.
Technology is always fun. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Ryan Dibala. I am a founder and naturalist guide for Birding Men Adventures, a birding company that I started in the Denver area in 2022. And I also have quite a extensive background in academia, as Clark expounded on quite nicely. Thank you for the warm introduction, Clark. I appreciate that. But I have little experience with Aiken Audubon. I've been to the Aiken Canyon Preserve, and I met Tally. We were on a tour out in Lamar and got to see some of the great birds of Colorado Southeast. But always have wanted to be more involved at Aiken, and I'm from Denver, so I'm actively involved with Denver Audubon. But it's a pleasure to be down here and meet some of you this evening, and I look forward to getting to know more of you. I've, as part of what I do now as a professional tour guide, I always love to get to know the birding community and get out and also try to educate when I can. You saw in my bio there that I studied bald eagles about 16 years ago. I worked with bald eagles about 16 years ago. That's a long time, right, to be presenting information on something that happened 16 years ago. I'm actually presenting on more updated information. I'll be presenting some information from Dr. Peter Sharp tonight. So he was gracious enough to update me with some of the more recent research that's been ongoing. So I'm excited to inform you of data all the way up through 2021 this evening. And I'll be speaking about my spark bird. Y'all know what a spark bird is? The bird that gets you into birding. So my spark bird. And I think we all can agree that as stunning as this bird is, and as beautiful it is, as it is, and as powerful and as much grace as it has, it's a very resilient bird. And throughout much of the 20th century, this bird was on the brink of extinction, and our nation's symbol, the bald eagle, has now made an amazing comeback. And I think it's quite obvious that this is we can proudly say that this is our most notable conservation success story in the lower 48 North America. I'll begin my talk tonight just by giving sort of a broad introduction to some of the population trends we've seen with bald eagles. And so I'll talk about the lower 48 states. I'll talk about bald eagles in Colorado, but then I'll really get to sort of the meat and potatoes of my presentation. We'll talk about bald eagle restoration on the Channel Islands. I had the great fortune of sort of randomly getting this internship in 2005. Actually, it was it was late 2005. I applied to be an intern with the Student Conservation Association, and they randomly assigned me to work with the Institute for Wildlife Studies in Avalon on Catalina Island to help restore bald eagles. I had a couple of friends and colleagues that applied to the SCA, and they got invasive plant eradication projects. And here I was getting this really sexy project working with bald eagles. It was incredible. I got so lucky. And so I went out to Catalina, and I got to spend time with Dr. Peter Sharp and help with this project that I'm about to present. And then I moved up to the Northern Channel Islands and worked on some bald eagle recovery efforts there in 2006. But we'll talk about what happened with the bald eagle, 2 phases of restoration on the Channel Islands, and then the population trends in general. And then we'll discuss where we are today and also some future concerns and research recommendations. I imagine many of you can remember the day when the end of the year was approaching and you still hadn't seen a bald eagle. Does that ring a bell? When I grew up in Connecticut, and I can remember many days, many years without ever seeing bald eagles when I was younger. And we know that the bald eagle population declined precipitously in the early 19th or the early 20th century. And by 1950, there were very few eagles in the United States, or the lower 48, I should say. By 1963, there were a recorded 417 nests. It reached an all-time low. And then in 1967, they were listed as endangered. The Endangered Species Act didn't come about until about 1973. but they were listed, they were pronounced as endangered and then immediately added to the Endangered Species Act. And then they were on that list until 1995. You'll see that 1972, DDT is banned. And I think we can't let it go unmentioned. I'm sure many of you are well aware of what DDT is, but we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight because it goes hand in hand with this story. And it's imperative that we mention DDT. By 1990, we saw 3,000, just over 3,000 nests. And then by 2000, that had doubled, so about almost 6,500 nests. So we're seeing this exponential increase. By 2009, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conducted an aerial survey, and they recorded over 30,000 nests. And then between 2009 and 2019, we get this huge jump. We get 71,467 nests that were recorded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And you can see this last bar on this histogram that it's shaded in blue. And over here on the left, on top, it says survey plus eBird data. So we're able to use this citizen science data now in addition to the aerial surveys, which allow scientists to use population demographic models and some of this citizen science data that's available to combine with the aerial surveys. And then we can kind of start to patch in those areas where the aerial surveys aren't covering. So yes, we have more data, but it's also much more accurate data. Now in 2000, well, from this survey in 2019, there were an estimated 316,000 individual eagles, and that number quadrupled since 2009. So we're seeing a massive, massive increase in the number of eagles on the landscape. Population trends in Colorado in the 1970s, there were 3 known active nests in Colorado, none of which were on the Front Range. And the first successful nesting pair in the Front Range was in 1989 at Bar Lake State Park up in Brighton, northeast of Denver. In 2023, Colorado Parks and Wildlife reported over 300 nesting pairs in the state. And so that's nearly a 17% increase since 2022. So here it's an alarming increase. And Colorado Parks and Wildlife is now undergoing quite an elaborate study looking at birds along the Front Range corridor, particularly in urban and in suburban environments, and how they're reacting and responding and sort of evolving in this landscape. It's fascinating. So why did the bald eagles decline so precipitously? Well, we know that they were persevered by humans. They were known to be dangerous to humans and livestock. This is from a 1908 film called Rescue from the Eagle's Nest, where someone has to go up to an eagle's nest to get the baby and bring it back down after it's been swept away by an eagle. These are really dangerous animals we're dealing with. This is a photo from Emerald Bay on Santa Catalina Island in the early 1900s, and you can see this woman sitting down. She's got a dead bald eagle on her lap, and so eagles were shot out of the sky just because they had a bad reputation. But I think we all know the main culprit is DDT. Let's see if I can remember what DDT is. Dichloral diphenyl dichloroethane. I think I got it. Yeah, long word, but DDT for short. DDT came about, it's an insecticide. It was used during World War II, used in Southeast Asia quite extensively for malaria control, also for insect and pest control. And then it was brought to the United States where it was used elaborately, put into different products. It was supposed to be good for your crops. It was supposed to be good for your garden, supposed to be good for your livestock, but it wasn't good for raptors. DDT, when it breaks down, it forms a metabolite called DDE, which is the responsible chemical for thinning eggshells. And so we can see these eggshells thinning rapidly to a point where we have complete reproductive failure of eagles, falcons, even pelicans. Anything really at the top of the food chain saw drastic declines because of DDT. And if you think back from high school biology class, you probably learned about biomagnification. Biomagnification happens when chemicals or heavy metals or pesticides accumulate in the sediments of an ecosystem, and then they sort of progressively magnify as they work their way up the trophic food chain. So you can see we have in this first level of trophic feeders, the benthic fish, the flounder, some of the fish swimming at lower levels, we have an average of 0.06 parts per million in their body. Then when they're ingested by sea lions and maybe smaller birds and larger fish, you get to about 3 parts per million. And then when you have the tertiary predators like eagles or ospreys feeding on those fish, they'll average about 6 parts per million in their DDE body concentration. So this is quite concerning as it works its way up the food chain. And one of the best places to look at biomagnification are in aquatic ecosystems. Marine ecosystems are a wonderful place to see this happening. And one of the best places we can look at right now is the Channel Islands. This brings us to the Channel Islands off the coast of Los Angeles, California, Southern California. We have the Northern Islands, which you can see sort of the northern cluster here, and we have the Southern Islands in the south. And then we also have Channel Islands National Park, which is made up of San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, Anacapa, and Santa Barbara. These 5 islands are part of the national park. The other islands in the south, San Nicolas, San Clemente, and Santa Catalina, are owned by other entities such as the US military and the Santa Catalina Island Conservancy. But our story starts on Santa Catalina Island. And turns out Santa Catalina Island was the site that was closest to a major DDT spill between the years of 1947 and 1971. We had greater than 1,800 metric tons of DDT actually actively discharged from the Montrose Chemical Corporation in their sewer sludge. And then they also did a deep sea dump between the years of 47 and 61. More than 500 metric tons of additional DDT were dumped into the ocean just off the coast of Long Beach. And so we know that bald eagles were native and are native to the Channel Islands. We think that there were probably between 15 and 30 pairs up until about 1950, when the last nesting bald eagle was found on the island of Santa Rosa. And so it's been quite some time since bald eagles have actively been reproducing on the islands. And a nonprofit that I mentioned earlier, the Institute for Wildlife Studies, they're out of Arvada, California. They decided that they wanted to go in and they wanted to actually reintroduce bald eagles to Catalina because it was the closest island to this toxic waste site, to this DDT dump spot. And they wanted to see if these eagles could reproduce on their own. So phase 1 of this project started in 1980. This is where Institute for Wildlife Studies biologists, they actually went up to places in Washington and Northern California and British Columbia. And when the birds were about 8 weeks old in those nests, in those states, they would move up to the nest and they would actually collect the eaglets and bring them down to Santa Catalina Island. Once they had the birds on Catalina Island, they would then introduce them to the island via hacking platforms. This is an 8 by 8 by 8 cage that's ventilated, has amazing views, and it's the home of these birds for about 4 weeks, between 8 weeks and 12 weeks. And at 12 weeks is when the bald eagle fledges. And so when 12 weeks comes around, this is when they open up the cage doors and the eagles can then test their wings. Biologists would leave carcasses out at this site to sort of mimic their food availability. In the wild, when they leave the nest, their parents continue to feed them for about a month, usually about a month or so. And so there was a known food source for these eagles as they were exploring their new territory. So 33 eagles were released between 1980 and 1986. You can see no birds were released in 1983. And then in 1986, they had 8 birds that were released to Santa Catalina Island. And by 1987, there was a pair that formed. Yay! And the pair got together and they laid 2 eggs. And what happened? They sat on the eggs and they broke them, sadly. So they failed. But fortunately, the biologists at IWS, Institute for Wildlife Studies, were able to climb up to the nest, collect the eggshell fragments, and analyze them and get great information on the contaminant analysis. So just for a reference here, eggshell thinning starts at about between 3 and 5 parts per million DDE. And then when we get to 15 parts per million DDE, that's where you have complete catastrophic failure of the nest. The egg collapses completely. In other places in the country, such as the Great Lakes, we were seeing moderate contamination, about 2.8 ppm. Out in the Columbia River Basin in Washington, they were seeing 9.7 ppm. And again, this was 1980. But when they, or sorry, 1987, and when they got these data back. And so when they got the data back from the cracked eggshells from that nest, almost 33 parts per million DDE. So we know that Southern California is very, very problematic in its contamination. Because the birds on Catalina, we knew that they would continue to fail because of this high concentration of DDE. Biologists decided that they would start this nest manipulation project. And so the idea was that biologists would set out into Catalina, they would monitor the eagles, they would figure out when they were pairing up, they would observe the nest, they'd see when a clutch was laid, and then they'd go out, they would remove the eggs, replace them with artificial eggs, and then take the eggs back to an incubation facility. Now, those first few years, 1988, 1989, they would actually take the eggs all the way back to the San Francisco Zoo at the Avian Conservation Center, and they would have the eggs incubated there. And they'd hatch the eaglets after about 5 weeks, and then they would start to care for the eaglets. So the incubation period is about 35 days for bald eagles on the southern islands of California. Part of that process is candling the egg and looking at the development of the embryo. So you can see the embryo forming there, a lot of the venation. And then when the babies hatched, well, we would feed them between 4 to 7 days. And they're very hungry little critters. I think they're very cute. Some people think they're sort of ugly. But they're baby bald eagles. Who can't love them? So they needed to be fed every 2 hours during daylight hours. So you can imagine it's a lot of feeding, a lot of upkeep. But the idea was to get them strong enough to be able to then foster them back into the nests. So this is what it looked like when the babies were returned. And I have some videos here of doing just that. But for the most part, the birds wouldn't make contact. They would just sort of swoop down and try to scare you off the nest. But there was actually one instance when we didn't wear helmets. This was when I was with him. It was 2005. We didn't wear helmets. And one time a bird swooped down and got Pete right on the back of the head, eight stitches worth on the back. And So his wife Donna was like, "You're wearing a helmet from this point on." So then it was helmets from that day forward. Uh, there was a nest that was impossible to get to. It was extremely precarious. And so what Peter Sharp, the lead biologist at IWS, had to do was tether himself to a rope connected to a helicopter and then get dangled out over the side of this nest. And we used to call him a dope on a rope. But this is some cool footage of that. Yeah, didn't miss his helmet. Reunion. This is the part where she eats them. No. Kidding. So no, they don't have to actually see their eggs hatch. All they need is a bobbling head in the nest, and that instinct kicks in to mother their babies. Yeah, and they don't even have to be their own. You can actually foster different birds into different nests. So the hatching success between 1989 and 2004 wasn't all that great. You see, there were about 81, well, there were 81 eggs removed from the nests on Catalina Island. And out of those 81 eggs, only 14 hatched. So we had a hatch success rate of 17.3%. But that was okay because actually the Avian Conservation Center at the San Francisco Zoo had 6 to 7 pairs of eagles that they had taken as wild individuals from California who were breeding and producing young. And so those young were used to foster into the nests that were unsuccessful. So even those nests where all of the eggs broke, those birds were still able to receive an eaglet and take care of that. As I mentioned, I had the great fortune of joining IWS in 2005. And so I was able to work at the incubation facility, which at that point in 2005, they had moved to the house in Avalon. So formerly they were incubating the eggs in the San Francisco Zoo, but they had created a new incubation facility just in downtown Avalon in a building that was highly sanitary, highly controlled, but we had tremendous success there. So between the years of 2005 and 2008, we hatched 17 chicks from 30 eggs with sort of a staggering hatch success rate of 57%, up from 17%. And we think that the improved hatch success rate is, well, it could be due to a number of things. There's decreased travel time between the nest site and the incubation facility. Now you don't even have to leave Catalina. And there was also a change in the incubation technique that was used. We went from a forced air incubator to a contact incubator. And so that could have had some impact in the success rate. The highest success there was in 2007 with 78% of the eggs hatching. When the birds are 8 weeks old in the nest, the biologists go back out to ban the birds. Of course, we want to keep tabs on where the birds are coming from, how old they are. If they die, we want to make sure we know which individuals they are. And if we see them out in the field, we want to be able to identify them and know where they come from. So this is a video just showing some of the practices when the biologists go about banning these birds. So of course, there's always the fear that you're going to approach the birds in the nest and they're going to take a dive. So it's very important to approach slowly and very carefully. And with 2 biologists in the nest is usually better than 1. So the second one can kind of come around the back and prevent it from toppling over the edge. Yeah, very sturdy nests. So one of the first things they do is take the cloacal temperature to get some information on the current health of the bird. I didn't. So, well, I'll show you in the next slide. I actually did band, but when we went up, we didn't take cloacal temperature, and some of the other measurements, the beak measurements, we didn't take because we had gotten those. Well, the biologist had gotten those several weeks earlier, so I didn't participate in those. But I did participate in banding and patagial wing markers, which we'll show here in a second. So there's the band going over the tarsus. and then they perforate the wing with this patagial marker. The birds on Catalina Island received an orange tag, and we'll see here in just a second, the birds up on Santa Cruz will receive a blue tag. So they're color coded for the island they come from. So it's a bit like piercing an ear. It's for visual identification, to be able to identify the bird in the field. And then also if you collect the body, if the bird dies or if somebody finds it, they'll know where it came from. The band does that as well. Yeah, so yeah, exactly. And if someone sees it and reports it and they see it from a distance, I think that's probably more so visual. And so here I am, yours truly at one of the nests. This is the Two Harbors nest. And yeah, pretty amazing to hold a bird of that size and have see how big the talons are right there in your hands. Is an incredible experience. So the second phase of the restoration was up in Channel Islands National Park. And the idea was, well, okay, if birds aren't making it here on Catalina Island, then maybe we can restore some birds to Santa Cruz, the largest island in the northern Channel Islands, and see if we can just leave them alone, let Mother Nature take its course, and see if they can actually reproduce without human intervention. And Santa Cruz is fairly isolated from the contamination site. So there was some good reason to believe that the eagles could make it on their own up there. This part of the project was funded by a lawsuit from a settlement in the United States versus the Montrose Chemical Corporation for $140.2 million, $30 million of which were used for Southern California island restoration. And similar to the Catalina story, they went out with these hacking platforms and they brought birds into the island. And initially they introduced 6 birds to Santa Cruz Island, and they would fit them with these blue patagial tags, as you see, and kind of integrate them to the island, or introduce them to the island the same way that we did on Catalina Island. They would also equip them with GPS transmitters on backpacks, and these transmitters activate or transmit a signal with Argo satellites. And so they do a great job of giving us updated and accurate information on where the birds are traveling. So 61 eagles were successfully released over 5 years. That's twice the number of eagles they were able to hack onto Catalina Island. And with those GPS transmitters, we got a lot of great data. You can see they moved around a whole lot from island to island. In some days, they would travel between all 4 islands in the Northern Channel Islands, between Anacapa, Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, and San Miguel. And these were updated every day, so we could keep our eye on one individual bird and see if it was hanging out in one area, and that would give us reason to believe that, oh, maybe it's nesting, maybe it's setting up a territory. We could also look at what the birds were doing that were going back to the mainland. Some of them traveled extremely far, as you can see here. And then we also collected some great information on bald eagle mortality. So we saw quite a few birds, particularly young birds, about a month after fledgling, or after a month after fledging, perished at sea. So we just sort of lost their signal out on the ocean. In this photo, this was in 2005, we had 2 birds that coupled up, and they started acting like they were a pair. And so we started to pay close attention to what these birds were doing. You can see, what's one thing that you notice about these birds? What color is their patagial marker? Orange. So where'd they come from? Catalina, yeah. So these are birds. These are 2 birds that were actually fostered into nests on Catalina. So they weren't hatched from the eggs that were laid there, but they were fostered in from birds that came from the San Francisco Zoo. So a pair that failed, they then brought in a fostered eagle, put it into the nest, and then these eagles dispersed naturally up to Santa Cruz, and they set up a territory. And so we had the West End, the 2002 West End nest bird, and the Twin Rocks bird from 2001. In 2006, I was able to join the team up in Santa Cruz Island where we track the birds with satellite GPS transmitters, but also with VHF telemetry, which you see here. I have this antenna. So this is kind of like the old school way of tracking birds using VHF signals. And we also use boats out on the coastline. And occasionally we go out on a helicopter to do nest surveys. So a lot of fun. In 2006, April of 2006, we had kind of a monumental moment in the history of bald eagles, I guess you could say, in the Channel Islands. We noticed that there was this pelican harbor nest that had formed, and these two birds that came up from Catalina Island that paired up, then successfully raised a chick. And so that was a great reason for celebration. It was the first unmanipulated successful nesting attempt up on Santa Cruz Island. This is the first time a bald eagle hatched in over 50 years. And about a month later, there was a bird who put a nest down on the ground, nested on the ground at the Malva Real nest, and they hatched. This pair hatched one successful eaglet as well. These two birds are still at their nests, and they still have their mates. The Pelican Harbor nest has been actively breeding, and they've been very successful. The Malva Real nest lost its partner, and now it's out on Santa Rosa Island looking for a mate. And so down on Catalina, this is 2007. We decided in 2007 that we would let 2 of the nests do their own thing, and then 3 of the nests we would continue to manipulate. Just because we're seeing this between 2001 and 2005, this very drastic increase in the nest success hatch rate, or sorry, the hatch success rate. We're starting to think that, well, maybe these birds can make it on their own. Maybe the DDE levels are starting to decline enough where they can make it naturally. And so we chose the Seal Rocks location, because this historically, the eggs hatched here have been significantly lower in DDE levels, and so they might have the best chance. And then the Pinnacle Rock nest, because the female here at this nest is one of the younger birds, and so just because she's younger, she's had less time to accumulate contaminants, we figured she might be a good prospect to let her do her thing on her own. And then we had 3 other nests, the Twin Rocks, the 2 harbors, and the West End nests that were continued to be manipulated the same way they were in previous years. And so when we look at eagles fledged per year by method, we could see that on Catalina, we have, between Catalina and all of the Channel Islands, we had a total of 114 hacked birds, so birds that jumped out of the hacking platform, 57 birds that were fostered, and then 215 natural births. And so you can see most of those natural births happened after 2007, and that was with all the Channel Islands combined. And then when we look at breeding territories per year by island, over the last 10 years, we've seen an increase in 280% in the number of breeding territories. And now 5 out of the 8 islands have nesting eagles. So this is an incredible success story. But just because you have more breeding territories doesn't mean you have increased productivity, right? You might have more eagles, but you might not be producing more birds. So when you have to look at the nesting success rate and also the fledglings per attempt. And so this graphic here shows the difference between the Southern Channel Islands and the Northern Channel Islands. We had a 69% nesting success rate on the Southern Channel Islands, and that's 1.09 fledglings per attempt, versus the Northern Channel Islands, where we had 62% nesting success with a 0.92 fledgling per attempt. And so if we average those out, we get an overall nesting success rate of 66% and a 1 fledgling per attempt. So each bird that attempts to breed, they will produce at least 1 fledgling. That's great. That actually meets the Pacific Region Bald Eagle Recovery Plan goal. So we're right on target for the Channel Islands bald eagle population. Now, why is the Southern Channel Islands, why are they showing a higher nesting success rate than the Northern Channel Islands? We know that Catalina Island's part of the Southern Channel Islands, and they have the closest proximity to the DDE contaminant site. So some of the reasons that the Northern Channel Islands might have that lower nesting success rate, we don't know, but some of the speculations are things like, well, there's different weather, We have younger birds that are nesting there, so they might have less experience because they've dispersed and they're young and they're just starting out. Also, there's a much more, I would say, a much more populous marine mammal population up on the Northern Channel Islands. So things like whales and dolphins. It's a national park, and so those areas might experience carcasses that have allowed DDE to come up through the food chain. So these animals on the higher trophic levels are washing up, and they're consuming those animals, and so they might be ingesting more DDE than those on the Southern Channel Islands. But again, more research is needed to really determine if that's true. So in 2021, this is what we're looking at here. We have 2020 breeding territories on 5 islands, and we have a total of about 75 bald eagles from hatch year to 25 years old. And so definitely a wonderful increase in the number of eagles on the Channel Islands. And when we look at some of the future concerns and research recommendations, they're continuing to do ongoing nest monitoring, although funding has kind of run out. And so I know IWS is looking for some donations and for some new sources of funding. We do need a better understanding of the nest successes and failures. We have some pairs that continue to fail all the time. And so why is that happening? Are they closer to higher DDE levels in the ocean? Are they eating food from those areas? What's going on? And so is it just because they don't have experience? So we can glean a lot of these things from future research. And just a bit more about IWS, 501c3 nonprofit. You can follow their project along with other projects that they have. They research Channel Islands, gray fox, wolverines, pumas. They have all sorts of cool research projects. And then you can also look at live nest cams that they have there. They have cameras set up on all of their nests on Catalina Island, which is fun to watch during the breeding season between February and July usually. So check them out. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Peter Sharp for providing this great data over the last few years, and also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Montrose Settlements Restoration Program that made this project possible, the San Francisco Zoo, Channel Islands National Park, Santa Catalina Island Conservancy, the Student Conservation Association that brought me there in the first place, and also the Nature Conservancy. And please connect with me. I'd love to. I would definitely love to meet all of you at some point and go birding with you. And yeah, always happy to meet new birders and share stories. And if you ever want to come up to Denver and check out one of my tours, I'm there running tours on the regular. I also lead some international tours and do some multi-day domestic tours. I do grouse tours in the spring and also a tour down to New Mexico in the winter. So love to meet all of you, and thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it. I'll take any questions if we have time.
Question?
Sure. Yeah.
Someone monitoring DDT levels in the fish or the ocean at the same time? Will that stuff ever go away?
Yes, in fact, there was just a study that was published in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in October, this past October, which shows that there's severe legacy effects of this DDE that's still remaining on those dump sites. And what's happened, they think, is a lot of it may have been covered up with sediment, but it's still there and it's still lingering. And when they catch flounder and other benthic fish that are spending time on the surface of those areas, they're finding exaggerated concentrations of DDE. So it's very much still in the environment. Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
Like, just like they live there, it's like, are they all just like protected areas?
so the question is, are these islands, are they populated or are they all protected? It's kind of a mix, but most of them are protected. Catalina Island has about 88% of the island is protected, and the rest of it is actually populated. The city of Avalon, between the city of Avalon and 2 harbors, there's a population of about 4,500 people, maybe 5,000 people. So it's not a huge population. And then on the southern islands, like I said, it's owned by the military. So there's some it's pretty desolate. Nobody really lives out there. It's just sort of it's military land. And then up on the Channel Islands, nobody lives up there either. There's a Navy base where we actually lived when we were there. A couple of campgrounds, but other than that, it's desolate. Yes.
Big are these islands?
Yeah, the islands.
Get a picture.
Yeah. So how big are the islands? They range from between 0.26 kilometers to about 0.26 kilometers squared to 26 kilometers squared. So
Between two areas, like I thought I heard 45,000.
sorry, 4,500. If I said 45,000, 4,500. Yeah. And they're about 60 to 80 kilometers off the coast.
Sure.
So, yeah.
And last question I have for you is, you look at any other contaminants, PCBs, for example, or you mostly concentrated on the because of the egg effect?
Yeah, me personally, I wasn't looking at other contaminants. I'm not entirely certain if IWS scanned for other contaminants in addition to DDE. So I would have to ask Pete about that. But certainly when I was there, we weren't looking at any other contaminants. It was solely DDE.
The island and coast, we know that currents move, and the northern islands are still having a greater effect by the contaminants than the southern islands. Can contaminants be moving like this along the coast or the northern islands?
They could be. I think that it's not really safe to say at this point that the DDE concentration is higher on the northern islands. I don't think we've revealed that. We know where the dumping site is. It's near the southern islands. It's right off the coast of Long Beach. But we saw lower nesting success on the northern islands, which, by association, you might think that the DDE levels are higher there, but I don't think that's been proven yet. So I think there's still a lot to determine. Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. Yes.
So you showed the number of beetles that have died, many in the water. Are the deaths declining over the years, or are they staying the same?
I don't know much about the mortality and how that compares from year to year. That's a very good question. I don't have data on that. I would imagine just due to the fact that there are more birds, you're going to see more mortality. You're going to have more birds traveling to the mainland where they're going to be interacting with power lines and windmills and all these things. So my guess would be that mortality is quite a bit higher now. Yeah, but
Contamination was winnowing away and wouldn't be causing any more deaths.
yeah, as far as acute contamination causing deaths, I'm not aware of that ever happening. I know it obviously resulted in the reproductive failure, but in terms of actually killing the birds, that's another good question. I don't know about that. Yeah. Yes.
Do you have any predators on the islands?
So do they have any predators on the islands? Yeah, so one thing that was really interesting is that they don't have any predators. They are a top tier predator on the island. But when they disappeared, they were replaced by golden eagles. And what we saw happening is the golden eagles, they started to depredate the island foxes. The Channel Islands have this endemic island fox. And that never happened with the bald eagle because they're fish specialists. They weren't eating terrestrial mammals. And so you had this whole new problem come about once the bald eagles were removed or extirpated from the area. And so part of this project actually was going out to capture golden eagles and bring them back to the mainland so that the bald eagles could get established. Yeah. I don't know. What would happen if you put a golden eagle head to head with a bald eagle? Who would win? But yeah, but to answer your question, they are top tier predators. There's nothing that would outrightly depredate them other than a human being. Yeah. Yeah, Clark.
What point did they consider the population recovery?
So I mentioned that right now it's meeting the standards from the California the California bald eagle population recovery, Pacific region bald eagle recovery plan. So their goal was to have at least one fledgling per attempt, and they're at that right now. So based on that goal, it's recovered. And so with that said, they're actually still actively hacking and fostering nests on Catalina because there are still incidences of nest failure, and they want to make sure that that population stays stable. And so they're continuing to do that, which is still a lot of work. I remember Pete saying, you know, it was 2005. And at that point in 2005, even though they were seeing this great hatch success rate, or this improved hatch success rate from 17% to 57%, he really didn't think that bald eagles would ever breed successfully on Catalina Island. And I think I missed a big point here. They eventually did. So these two nests that they let go, that they didn't mess with, they were both successful. They both raised two chicks successfully for the first time on Catalina Island. But with that said, there's still nests that are failing. But yes, so I would say that it's recovered, but there's still a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Thanks again, Ryan.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys.
For the dance drawing for the birds.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks everyone online. Let me double check, see if there are any questions. All right, we had one online question. Do you know anything about the success of bald eagles near Lake Tahoe?
Oh, I can't say I do.
No, sorry, no information here, but yeah.
Anecdotally, told me that bald eagles are also thriving in California, and I would assume they're doing great near Tahoe.
All right, so it sounds like they're probably doing great near Tahoe. All right, go ahead, Tally, the drawing. All right, thanks again, everyone. Have a good night, and we hope to see you soon.